Hello, everyone. My name is Noreen Lawler, Development and Training Executive with CPSMA, and you're very welcome to today's Health and Safety webinar, which is a follow-on from our introductory webinar broadcasted in April 2021. Now, last year's webinar, which I hope you've had an opportunity to view, was an introduction to health and safety in the context of the Board of Management's responsibilities. In it, we spoke about creating awareness, making health and safety an integral part of how the school operates. We covered the identification of risks and how risks can be mitigated. We looked at an overview of a safety statement. We discussed the role of a safety representative as opposed to a safety officer. That is, that the safety representative is the elected spokesperson for the staff on issues concerning health, safety, and welfare. The appointment of a safety representative is an entitlement under the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act of 2005. Now, a safety officer, on the other hand, is usually a member of the Board of Management who can help to support the implementation, review, and maintenance of a safety, health and welfare management system. Now, whilst there's no legal requirement to appoint a safety officer, it is recommended that boards give consideration to appointing one of their members to this role. Now, we were also joined by Alan Black. Alan is the Religious and Education Manager with Allianz Insurance, and Alan gave us general advice on beginning that health and safety journey in your school. Alan mentioned at the time that Allianz was preparing resources for schools to assist all schools really in the process of conducting risk assessments. Since then, Allianz has published a risk assessment for primary schools, and it's a booklet which identifies a number of recurring hazards in school settings, with particular reference to the classroom, the staff room, school office, sports hall and corridors, the school grounds and other areas. And finally, they provide guidance on completing a risk assessment. Allianz has also produced 4 accompanying videos for each of the areas listed, and I'm delighted to welcome Alan back to bring us through this risk assessment process for 2 of these listed settings.
Okay, so our first scene is a classroom. As mentioned previously, for each area we will look at the scene from 2 different points of view. Firstly, we will look at an area in which there are quite a number of obvious risks and hazards present. Then we will look at a cleaned up scene and point out the good risk factors that have been put in place. I'll present this in a very practical way so you can make real changes quickly and cost effectively in your own schools. Firstly, you'll see a coffee mug on the table here. So hot liquids should not be brought out of the staff room, as they have the possibility of scalding a pupil if somebody was to run into the teacher holding the mug. We've seen these types of accidents on a semi-frequently basis in the past, and if this practice is allowed, certainly if open mugs are being used, there's a real likelihood of an accident and there's no defence for such a claim. So as you know, this can be an unpopular measure, so some schools do allow hot beverages to be brought out of the classroom, but only in a secure travel mug. It's much safer in that circumstance. So then you have untidy and overstacked shelves, and this can be a real danger. There are many issues attached to this. In some cases we have seen items that young children should be able to access put onto higher shelving, and therefore climbing aids would be required. And this is avoidable if these items are put within reach of the children on lower shelves. In some cases, overstacked shelves can lead to items falling down and hitting people. And in other cases we've seen heavy items being stored on top shelves, logic being that they're barely used. But the problem is that when they are required, it can be quite dangerous to access them, and we have seen a number of avoidable serious injuries occurring. So taps in classroom areas have 2 potential issues here. First, they can lead to wet floors, so it's really important that any spills are identified in the classroom and the classroom teacher understands it's their responsibility to address the issue. They may be cleaning them themselves or calling on a caretaker or a cleaner. Now this will depend on the school and the resource available to you, But it's important that the class teacher knows what their role is and that this is documented in the risk assessment. In some isolated cases, we have seen some hot taps with a misfunctioning thermostat. In these cases, water can become boiling and scald the user, so these need to be checked periodically. So coats and bags, these can be a tripping hazard, and therefore it's important that these are stored out of walkways. For coats, it's usually best to store them in a common area rather than on the back of chairs. When it comes to bags, it's important that they are stored safely out of walkways. This can be under desks or it can be in a common area, whichever is deemed more practical. I think this is a good opportunity now at this point to discuss classroom culture. So as with anything culture related, it's a matter of tone from the top. And while you as the manager of the school are responsible for this tone at the school level, it's really important you obtain buy-in from your staff in this regard, because the teacher then is ultimately responsible for setting the safety culture within the classroom. So it's up to the teacher to ensure there is a tidy classroom floor, safe walking aisles, safe stacking of classroom library shelves and items like that. Therefore, it's really important that the classroom teacher talks about this from time to time and narrates to the children why it's important and how good practices serve to keep everybody safe. Mats, so upturned and damaged mats are a trip hazard and should not be in the classroom if they are damaged, or anywhere in the school for that matter. It's important that these are identified and replaced if they cannot easily be repaired. And then loose cables, they are also a real trip and fall hazard, primarily for the teacher, but this can also be for the caretaker, cleaners or pupils. It's really important that the wires between laptops and whiteboards and other equipment are secured out of the walkways so they're not presenting a trip hazard. Sometimes these are fixed in place and these can be easier to deal with because you can see them, but other times there are temporary IT practices. So these should be risk assessed to make sure that if they occur on occasion, that there's an adequate solution for the wires in those situations too. So now we'll go over to the scene where measures have been put in place to reduce the risk of accidents occurring. Firstly, posters should be hung at a height that is reachable by a two-step ladder. This is really important as we often see claims involving standing on chairs or standing on desks, and even on occasion we have seen claims where a chair has been put onto a desk for additional height, and this can lead to significant injuries. The freestanding shelving units, these should always be secured to a wall so they cannot fall over. Cleaning supplies, so if the cleaning supplies are kept in a classroom, they should be locked away. If they're kept in a central supply closet outside of the classroom, so somewhere else in the school, this should be locked to ensure that younger pupils cannot access and accidentally consume them. The toilet floors, similar to the classroom, they need to be checked for wet floors. So if somebody slips on a wet floor, the school will be asked then to prove that they had a system of work in place to identify such issues. So again, this is where the culture comes in. The children should be encouraged to advise the classroom teacher if the floor is wet, because the teacher may not be in there otherwise to identify it themselves. But falling off ladders is also a serious issue. So it's worth mentioning that teachers that may be required to hang posters and other such items should have access to a small two-step ladder, so they don't need to take it upon themselves to use any other means that may be unsafe. So here's a quick recap of the issues that we've just discussed. As you can see, the measures are all very practical and easily put in place. When all of these measures are addressed, it will significantly reduce the risk of an injury occurring in the classroom. Okay, so now we're going to look at the outside area of your school. We see a lot of personal injury claims occurring in these areas, as this is typically the area that pupils can run around and play games. Play areas are designed for running and playing, so it's not about curtailing the activities. It's more so to provide some tips and measures that can be taken in these areas to reduce the possibility of an accident occurring. You'll find that defects or areas in poor condition can be addressed with additional funding from the Department of Education. If the issues identified present a real health and safety concern to the users of your school. If you do identify an issue, please feel free to contact your local Allianz rep who can inspect the area and comment if it does actually need to be repaired or replaced. And this may actually assist with any subsequent funding application. So firstly, we'll look at fencing. So fencing should be inspected once a term, and if this is damaged, it should be repaired, or in some circumstances, it may need to be replaced. When carrying out an inspection, you're looking for obvious defects that may cause tripping hazards or protruding pieces that may cause an injury. Timber products such as benches and tables should be checked for defects once a term. You're looking out for poor condition of the wood that can lead to splinters or cuts, and protruding or rusty nails that may lead to more serious injuries. These items, once identified, can be easily repaired. So play equipment and their surface should be supplied and installed by a bona fide contractor and certified by the European safety standards EN 1176 for equipment and EN 1177 in respect of surface areas. If the correct certification is not in place, it will be very difficult to defend a claim that may occur in this area. Homemade obstacles should not be used in playgrounds, and the equipment that is used should be checked regularly to ensure that everything seems safe. These inspections should be recorded as being completed at regular intervals, at least once a term again. Manhole covers and drains should be secured in place. If they're broken in any way, they should be replaced as soon as possible. Steps, I think you'll find the nosing on steps should be painted yellow. You'll have seen it in many circumstances and may have it in some areas around your school. Yellow or some other high vis colour. This clearly signifies then the change in level of the ground. If there are 3 or more steps as well and it's wider than 1.5 metres, a handrail should be fitted. Onto oil tanks then. Oil tanks, there are a number of simple pieces of advice to follow, and we actually have a blog on our website regarding oil tanks for more detailed information. Firstly, it's very important that the oil tank has a bund around them to retain any oil that may leak. This happens more often than you think. Theft of oil is becoming an increasing issue with the cost of fuel rising, and thieves really don't care about any environmental impacts of the overflow of the oil that they're stealing, and this can routinely cost up to 6 figures to repair the environmental damage. Therefore, security is really important, and don't forget when securing your tank that the pipe leading to the tank also needs to be secured too. So basketball stands, you'll know, they're a feature of practically every primary school in Ireland. So it's really important that the upright stand is padded to soften the blow if any pupil happens to run into them. The playground areas then, they really need to be secured outside of school hours and when not in use. If access to these areas is very easy, you'll find that equipment will be broken and your school may become a destination for unwanted guests when your school is closed. Garden areas, so more and more schools have garden areas, which is fantastic. So between the garden areas and your general grounds, they should be free from loose objects or old equipment that is no longer in use. Objects such as tools that are used regularly should be stored safely, and then loose objects can cause trip hazards, can also be used by unwanted guests to damage property, or may blow around during storms and cause property damage. So again, just make sure that they're all put away. All surface areas need to be checked to ensure they're in good condition. If you have concrete play areas, they should be checked to ensure the surface is not broken or protruding, which could cause trip and fall hazard. And then tarmac areas should not be full of loose stone that may cause scarring in the event of somebody actually falling on that type of surface. Grass areas, particularly sports fields, should be free from debris and potholes and checked regularly for both. Schools that have flat roofs definitely should not let pupils access this roof to retrieve balls under any circumstance. If a staff member is expected to retrieve the balls, they must receive training in the safe use of ladders and also be supplied with an appropriate ladder. It's also essential that another staff member must also be present to support the ladder. In the boiler house, it's very important that combustible or flammable materials must not be stored in the boiler house. And it's absolutely essential that the boiler house has an automatic fire extinguisher installed. So please do check this if you're not sure if your school has one, and install one immediately if it's not in place already. And just another little tip in terms of kind of boilers, it really is essential to have a frost thermostat fitted to your boiler to ensure that your heating will kick in when the temperature gets too low. This will definitely help prevent burst pipes. So now here's just a quick recap of the tips that I've outlined. And just remember, You're not responsible for all of this by yourself. A functioning safety committee within the school will take the burden off you as a school principal, while also ensuring health and safety matters are a focus in the school and there's a system in place to address such matters. If you are insured directly with Allianz, please feel free to reach out to your local Allianz representative for any advice on health and safety matters, or any of the matters we've talked about so far. They can also assist you actually carry out a practical risk assessment. And if you're insured through an insurance broker, you will need to contact your broker for any assistance.
Thank you, Alan. Attendees from last year's webinar requested more detailed information on conducting a risk assessment, and your input on the use of the Allianz templates certainly gave us a sense of a risk assessment in action, so thank you so much for that. I now want to move on to a topic that gave rise to a number of queries in April of this year, when the Department of Education issued an information note regarding school administration. Now, the note stated, among other things, that schools must ensure that a safety statement is in place to reduce the risk of injury and illness and put appropriate provision in place to safeguard the school community. Now, as I mentioned at the outset, we addressed the safety statement in our 2021 webinar. Now, the information note also stated that the safety statement should clearly outline how the school provides and maintains first aid equipment and supplies, and how staff are trained in the use of these. It states, schools should ensure that first aid supplies and training for first aid is kept up to date. The note made reference to the school-specific resources that are available on the HSA, that is the Health and Safety Authority website. Now, we've already looked at guidelines on managing safety, health and welfare in primary schools. Today, we're going to have a look at the guidance offered by the HSA in relation to first aid. In relation to the provisions for first aid, the Board of Management, as an employer, is required to provide and maintain suitably marked and easily accessible first aid equipment. In general terms, the first aid equipment provided must be adequate and appropriate to the place of work, in this case, to the school. But even at that, the first aid provisions can vary from school to school depending on a number of factors. The HSA website provides a table listing the recommended contents of first aid boxes and travel kits, but remember, this covers the requirements for all workplaces, including construction sites and factories. Now, a school must consider what is adequate and appropriate for its particular setting, based on the possible scenarios where first aid would be required. Common causes of physical harm in schools are slips, trips and falls, particularly in the playground. So whilst the list on the HSA website is extensive, you have flexibility in terms of what needs to be included, provided it is adequate for your particular working environment. The Primary School Guidelines for Managing Safety, Health and Welfare contains a similar list of recommended contents in the form of a risk assessment. A travel kit for school tours or sporting events, etc., should also be available for use when pupils are off-site. It is important that the location of the first aid equipment is known to all members of staff and that it is readily accessible for use by any staff member who is administering first aid. The area designated for first aid treatment should also be clear, and there should be a nominated member of staff with the responsibility of ensuring that adequate supplies are available. The school should also retain a written record of the first aid treatment administered. In terms of further reporting, every Board of Management is legally required to report specific accidents and incidents to the Health and Safety Authority. A school must report the injury of any employee as a result of an accident while at work, where the injury results in the employee being unable to carry out their normal work for more than 3 consecutive days, excluding the day of the accident. This report can be submitted in hard copy or online through the HSA website. One of the questions that is often asked by our schools is, do we need a qualified first aider on the staff? Now, I think it's important to state that occupational first aid ranges from the treatment of minor cuts to the treatment of life-threatening injuries. In terms of having a qualified first aider on the staff, the school will need to assess the risk factors involved to determine whether or not this would be a requirement. A risk assessment in the context of the school's safety statement should consider the numbers employed as well as non-employees, that is, students in the school, the nature of the work environment, the degree of hazard, the level of accidents arising, the size and location of the workplace, and the distance from medical services, etc. If the risk assessment shows that an occupational first aider is required, then the school should undertake to identify school personnel who will avail of first aid training, provided by an approved organisation. Occupational first aid certification is valid for 2 years. Outside of the specific occupational health training that we've discussed here, many schools undertake basic first aid training for all staff. In general, schools will have practices and procedures in place around the treatment of minor injuries, scrapes, grazes or cuts, where staff members will exercise that duty of care to alleviate discomfort and where treatment by a medical practitioner is not required. Parents and guardians should be asked to ensure that emergency contacts are kept up to date so that they can be contacted in the event of more serious injuries, for example, a head injury or eye or dental injury or a suspected fracture. There is a requirement to have the names, addresses and telephone numbers of local emergency services clearly displayed, and these should be updated as required to ensure that prompt action is taken if medical intervention is required immediately. So finally, at the outset, we described today's webinar as a progression from our introductory webinar on health and safety in the school environment. We hope that it achieved its objectives, and we hope that the webinar provides you with further support in fulfilling your health and safety responsibilities as a board. To that end, I would like to thank Alan Black, Religious and Education Manager with Allianz Insurance, for his contribution to today's session and for his team's ongoing support of our schools. Our thanks also to H2 Learning for facilitating the delivery of the webinar, and finally to you, our attendees, for engaging in today's Board of Management training. Thank you and stay safe. Slán Tom.